Life is complicated, yeah? Life never quite goes along as easily as we want it to go along, or as we think it should go along, or as we think it is actually going along. Right? Going along and suddenly curves happen, bumps happen, life happens, things change. It's one of the powerful things about that story of Abraham and Hagar and Ishmael. It's the reminder that everything should be going along perfectly, but things never go along perfectly. Life is like that. When I read this story, it firstly made me think of numerous things that have been in the news lately. Numerous stories. I mean, there's at least one every day, every newscast, every station. A story of someone being disregarded. A story of someone being thrown out with the trash, so to speak. For whatever reason, reading this story made me flash to the story of the Dion quintuplets. There was something in the news just a couple of weeks ago about how the museum that's in the house that the Dions were born in 1934, that the museum is closing because nobody's going there anymore. No one seems to care about the story, which intrigued me. And as I read that, I thought of the movie that the CBC made. I'm terrible at remembering dates. I want to say about 25 years ago now, quite a while ago at least. A movie about the story of the Dions. And when I watched it on DVD, they had one of those, clips about the making of the movie. And they were interviewing Beau Bridges, who plays the doctor in the film. And he talks about how when he was first given the script, he read it, and he decided there was no way he was going to do this movie because this was a really stupid story. He said, no one is going to believe this story. This is a ridiculous story that someone would have 5 babies in the 1930s in northern Ontario, that the province of Ontario would build what was then a super highway from Toronto up to this 2-bit town so that people could go and see these kids, that the largest amusement park in Canada would be built up there and it would be called Quintland. And he said, worst of all, what no one will believe about this story is the fact that the government stepped in and took these kids away from their parents. No one is going to buy this story, he said. At which point someone had to say to him, but these are all facts. This is a true story. This is what really happened. And at that point, he decided to be in the film. It's an incredible story, but the piece that really stuck out for me in it was the fact that, yes, the government stepped in almost instantly after the birth of those quintuplets and took them from their parents. And when the government of Ontario finally settled with the surviving sisters a few years ago, they admitted that probably they would not have done that if the parents had not been Francophone and had not been Roman Catholic. That those two factors said to society in general, and especially to the then government of Ontario, you're not good enough to do this. We're pushing you aside. The story of Hagar and Ishmael reminds us that too often in life, people get pushed aside. And we always can justify it, can't we? Right? Whenever we have to step in and push someone aside, there's always a good reason for it. Or so we'd like to think. We're not really presented with how Abraham would have struggled. I picture that it was perhaps a bit like Abraham shared a moment ago. Struggling, trying to figure out what was the right way to do things. No one would have thought it was at all strange in those days for Abraham to have slept with Sarah's slave, because she herself would have been a throwaway person. So it would not have been considered strange, and it was a way to solve the problem of not having a child. So Abraham and Hagar had Ishmael. But then when Isaac comes along, things get complicated, because they do in life, don't they? Things are starting off on an even keel, and then the boat begins to rock. And when Ishmael and Isaac exist, There's too much tension for the story to keep going. Now, we read the Bible, we read the story told by the descendants of Isaac, not the descendants of Ishmael. Our story follows the line of Isaac, and so we have to get rid of Ishmael. But what's fascinating about this story, this is why I love the fact that it's in the lectionary and we have this opportunity to look at it for a moment. What I love about this story is they don't just disappear. Hagar and Ishmael are sent away, but we get a little bit of their story. Not much, but a little bit. Of them struggling to survive, and of God intervening and taking care of them, and of saying, in essence, you may have been thrown away by other people, but I will not throw you away. And I believe through that story, God says that to us about all people. Yup, all of them. Even the ones that we want to ignore, and we all do. I do. There are times when it would sure be helpful if folks would slip away, because it's much easier to deal with things this way. The story of Ishmael's descendants, interestingly, does exist. We struggle with the fact that it exists because, well, it's the other story, right? It's the story of the losers. We have the story of the winners, because history is always told by the winners, always. Or by, at the very least, someone who the author thought should be the winner, usually the winners. Ishmael's story is told somewhere else. It's told in the Quran. As Ishmael goes off, as we're told in this story, to be the founder of a great nation. And his nation, the nation that he is the founder of, is the Arab peoples. And, well, you may have heard Arabs and Israelis have had some problems over the years. Just saying. It's a reminder that when we throw people away, the problems don't disappear, because throwing people away is not the way to solve problems. It just doesn't work. We don't learn that very well from this story, even though we have this story there as a wonderful lesson for us. Years ago in Hawaii, I remember a fellow saying, wouldn't it be wonderful if just once, we could have the story of lion hunting told by the lion? Just imagine that story. It would be substantially different than the story we usually tell, which is told from the view of the hunter. It was kind of neat about 9 years ago when Alan Akana published a history of Hawaii. It's a short book, but nonetheless dealt with some of the major events in Hawaiian history. Alan was the first Hawaiian ever to write a history of Hawaii. It's the first time that story was ever told, if you will, by the lions. And I remember giving a copy to Uncle Chulak and saying, it's here, finally, the lion has told the story of the lion hunt. We read so many stories in the paper, we hear so many stories, we hear of people who are thrown away, or people who are essentially thrown away. Classic example, the many, many, many stories we have about racial interaction that we just don't quite get. There's no real explanation as to how they happen, and there's such long history behind judging people along racial lines that we don't know what to do when there isn't even a story, but where there might be a story, or maybe there should be one, but there isn't. And it reminds us of the incredible amount of work that we need to do as community to struggle with, and not to throw aside the issue, the stories of dealing with intrinsic racism, but rather to look at those stories and to embrace them and to figure out from them how we get along without just throwing people away, without just finding a reason to put them down, to cast them off. It's difficult. And yet we read in this story, this simple story of Hagar and Ishmael, that when Abraham sends them away, God does not send them away. When we want to write someone off, God does not do that. When we want to ignore someone, God does not ignore them. We're getting ready this week to celebrate 150 years of this experiment called Canada. And it's got its pros and its cons in our history. And we will for the next 150 years, I'm guessing. I'm not planning on being around quite all of that time. It will be uncomfortable and it will be messy because human life is like that. But maybe, just maybe, as we ponder stories like this one, we can go a little bit further. We can pause to listen to the stories of the hunted, of the lions, of the stories that we tend to write off. We can listen to those stories, listen to those people, learn from them, appreciate them, celebrate them. Know that God is with them in their stories too.